In the spring of 1984, in the small town of Millbrook Ridge, Pennsylvania, something happened that the entire community would remember as either a miracle or a nightmare, depending on who you asked. The local elementary school, St. Catherine's, held a ceremony that 73 people attended. There were flowers, cake, and a photographer from the town newspaper. The headline the next day read, "Love knows no boundaries. Teacher and student unite in holy union." What the newspaper didn't mention was that the bride was 11 years old, still losing her baby teeth, and the groom was her 34-year-old teacher, Mr. Daniel Corvus. What they also didn't mention was that by the time anyone realized something was terribly horrifically wrong, it was already too late to save her. This isn't a story about love. This is a story about how an entire town became complicit in something so disturbing that even now, decades later, those who were there refuse to speak about it. This is about how evil doesn't always announce itself with violence or screams. Sometimes it wears a suit and tie, stands at the front of a classroom, and everyone calls it respectable. Sometimes it gets celebrated with cake and champagne while a child's life is stolen in plain sight. And sometimes the most terrifying part isn't what happened, but how everyone convinced themselves it was beautiful. Her name was Rebecca Ann Thorne, but everyone called her Becca. She had strawberry blonde hair that her mother braided every morning, freckles across her nose that darkened in summer, and a gap between her front teeth that made her self-conscious when she smiled. She collected stickers, loved reading Nancy Drew mysteries, and wanted to be a veterinarian when she grew up. She was in 5th grade at Catherine's Elementary, where she'd attended since kindergarten, in a classroom with faded alphabet posters on the walls and the smell of chalk dust, permanently embedded in everything. Her teacher that year was Mr. Corvus, and according to everyone who knew them, they had something special. The first time anyone noticed something unusual was in October of 1983, 3 months into the school year. Becca's mother, Diane Thorne, came to pick her up after school and found the classroom empty except for Becca and Mr. Corvus. They were sitting close together at his desk, his hand resting on her shoulder, looking at something in a book. When Diane knocked on the doorframe, Mr. Corvus looked up with a smile that Diane would later describe as too friendly, too familiar, like he'd been caught doing something he shouldn't, but knew he could explain it away. He told her they were discussing Becca's essay about her favorite animal, that Becca showed remarkable intelligence for her age, that she was special, gifted even. Diane felt something uncomfortable twist in her stomach, but she pushed it away because Mr. Corvus was respected, well-liked, and had taught at St. Catherine's for 6 years without incident. She told herself she was being paranoid. The second time was in November, when Becca came home wearing a necklace she hadn't left with that morning. It was a delicate silver chain with a small heart pendant. Nothing expensive, but clearly not something an 11-year-old would buy herself. When Diane asked where it came from, Becca's face lit up with genuine joy, and she said Mr. Corvus had given it to her because she'd gotten the highest score on the spelling test. Diane felt that uncomfortable twist again, stronger this time, and she asked Becca if Mr. Corvus gave gifts to other students. Becca said no, just her, because she was his favorite, because she was special. Diane wanted to march to that school immediately and demand answers, but her husband Robert told her she was overreacting, that teachers gave students rewards all the time, that she was reading too much into an innocent gesture. So Diane said nothing, but she watched her daughter more carefully. The third time was in December, during the winter concert at school, when Diane saw Mr. Corvus standing at the back of the auditorium, with his eyes fixed on Becca the entire time she sang. He wasn't watching the performance generally, the way other teachers did. He was watching Becca specifically, with an intensity that made Diane's skin crawl. After the concert, he approached their family and complimented Becca effusively, his hand touching her hair, his voice warm and intimate in a way that felt wrong. Robert shook his hand and thanked him for being such a dedicated teacher. Diane said nothing because, What could she say that wouldn't sound insane? That a respected teacher was looking at her daughter the wrong way? That his praise felt too personal? That something in his eyes made her want to grab Becca and run? By January 1984, Becca was staying after school twice a week for what Mr. Corvus called advanced tutoring sessions. He'd sent a note home explaining that Becca demonstrated exceptional academic potential and that he wanted to provide her with additional enrichment opportunities at no cost to the family. Robert was thrilled, proud that his daughter was smart enough to warrant special attention. Diane was suspicious, but when she accompanying Becca to these sessions, Robert accused her of being helicopter parent, of not trusting the school, of letting her imagination run wild. The principal, Sister Margaret, assured Diane that Mr.'s tutoring program had helped several students over the years, and that parents should feel grateful to have such a dedicated educator. So Diane relented, hating herself for it, watching her daughter walk back into that school twice a week, while everything inside her screamed that something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. What Diane didn't know was that during those tutoring sessions, Mr. Corvus wasn't teaching Becca mathematics or literature. He was teaching her about their special connection, about how most people wouldn't understand what they had, about how this was something pure and beautiful that the world would try to destroy because people feared what they didn't comprehend. He told her she was mature for her age, that she understood things other children couldn't, that he'd never met anyone like her. He showed her poetry by romantic poets and explained it was about love that transcended social conventions, about connections that society tried to suppress because they were too powerful, too threatening to the established order. He played her classical music and told her it was composed for muses who inspired greatness, just like she inspired him. He never touched her inappropriately during these sessions, never did anything that could be definitively called abuse, but he was grooming her meticulously, carefully building a framework in her 11-year-old mind, where what was about to happen would seem not only acceptable, but inevitable, even beautiful. In February, Mr. Corvus invited the Thorne family to dinner at his apartment. He said he occasionally liked to get to know the families of his most promising students outside the classroom environment, that it helped him understand how to best support their educational journey. Robert accepted enthusiastically. Diane wanted to refuse but couldn't articulate why without sounding paranoid or rude. The dinner was perfectly pleasant and perfectly normal. Mr. Corvus served pot roast and mashed potatoes, asked polite questions about Robert's work as an insurance agent and Diane's part-time job at the library, showed them photos of his family back in Ohio, and discussed education philosophy in measured, intellectual terms. There was nothing overtly wrong with the evening, nothing Diane could point to as evidence of her fears. But she noticed how Mr. Corvus's attention kept returning to Becca, how he smiled at her in a way that felt too intimate, how he'd arranged for Becca to sit next to him at the table. When they left that night, Robert remarked what a nice man Mr. Corvus was, how lucky Becca was to have such a caring teacher. Diane said nothing, but she barely slept that night. March brought the first major shift in what everyone later called the situation. Corvus requested a parent-teacher conference with the Thornes, unusual for mid-semester, but not unprecedented. When they arrived at the classroom after school, Miss Corvus sat them down with serious expressions and explained that he'd noticed Becca seemed troubled lately, withdrawn, and after some gentle questioning, she'd confided in him that she felt misunderstood at home, that her parents didn't really see her for who she was becoming. He said this with such concern, such apparent care for Becca's well-being, that Robert immediately became defensive, asking what exactly Becca had said. Corvus, smooth as glass, explained that it was nothing specific, just the normal rolling pains of a gifted child who was starting to outgrow her environment, who needed intellectual and emotional stimulation that exceeded what a typical family could provide. He suggested gently that perhaps Becca might benefit from spending more time in enriching environments under his mentorship, where her unique qualities could be properly nurtured. Diane felt like she was watching a trap close around her daughter in slow motion, but when she objected, Mr. Corvus had an answer for everything. He had educational articles about gifted children. He had testimonials from other parents whose children had thrived under his guidance. He had Sister Margaret's full endorsement. He had Robert nodding along, increasingly convinced that his daughter's teacher understood her better than he did. By the end of the meeting, they'd agreed that Becca would spend additional time after school with Miss Corvus and that he would take her on weekend educational trips, museums and historical sites to further her development. Diane felt like she'd just signed something terrible into existence, but she had no proof, no evidence, nothing but a gnawing certainty that something was catastrophically wrong. The weekend trips began in April. Miss Corvus would pick Becca up Saturday mornings and return her Sunday evenings, claiming they'd visited the Philadelphia Museum of Art, or attended an educational lecture, or toured a historical site. Becca would return quiet and distant, not meeting her mother's eyes, clutching books Miss Corvus had given her with titles like The Age of Innocence and Jane Eyre that Diane thought were too advanced and too thematically inappropriate for an 11-year-old. When Diane tried to talk to Becca about these trips, her daughter responded with phrases that sounded rehearsed, adult, nothing like how Becca normally spoke. She talked about intellectual awakening and emotional maturity and connections that transcend conventional understanding. It was like watching her daughter disappear into someone else's script. Diane felt powerless to stop it. She tried talking to other parents at school, carefully, feeling out whether anyone else noticed anything strange about Mr. Corvus. Most dismissed her concerns entirely. One mother said Mr. Corvus had tutored her son last year, and it had been wonderful, that he was devoted and kind. Another said Diane should feel grateful to have a teacher who cared so much that most teachers these days couldn't be bothered. When Diane tried to express her discomfort with the overnight trips, another parent laughed and said she was being overprotective, that Becca was growing up and needed independence. Nobody saw what Diane saw, or maybe they saw it and chose not to look directly at it, because that would require acknowledging something too terrible to face. In early May, Becca asked her mother if she believed in soulmates. She was sitting at the kitchen table doing homework, or pretending to, her eyes unfocused and distant. Diane's blood ran cold. She asked Becca why she was asking. Becca said Mr. Corvus had been teaching her about different kinds of love, about how the ancient Greeks had multiple words for love because they understood that connection between souls wasn't limited by age or social rules, or what other people thought. She said it so matter-of-factly, like she was reciting something she'd memorized, and Diane felt the world tilt sideways. She tried to ask more questions, tried to understand what exactly Miss Corvus had been telling her daughter, but Becca shut down immediately, said her mother wouldn't understand, said nobody understood except Mr. Corvus, because he was the only one who really saw her. That night, Diane told Robert they needed to pull Becca out of Miss Corvus's class immediately, that something was happening and they needed to protect their daughter. Robert, frustrated and tired of what he saw as Diane's paranoid obsession, asked what exactly she thought was happening. Diane couldn't articulate it clearly, because Miss Corvus had been so careful, had never done anything definitively wrong that she could point to as evidence. All she had was instinct, fear, and a collection of small incidents that individually seemed innocent, but together formed a horrifying pattern. Robert told her she was being irrational, that she was damaging their daughter's educational opportunities because of some unfounded anxiety, that if she had real concerns, she should talk to Sister Margaret, but otherwise she needed to let it go. They fought for hours that night, their voices rising and falling through the small house, and upstairs in her room, Becca listened through the walls and wrote in the diary Mr. Corvus had given her about how nobody understood them, how love was persecution by the unenlightened. The meeting that changed everything happened on May 15, 1984, in Sister Margaret's office at St. Catherine's Elementary. Diane had requested it after finding something in Becca's room that made her hands shake so badly she could barely dial the school's number. It was a letter, written in Miss Corvus's neat, precise handwriting, addressed to my dearest Rebecca. The letter talked about patience and waiting, and how our time will come when the world is ready to see what we see. It talked about the purity of our connection and the inevitability of our union. It never explicitly stated anything illegal, never confessed to anything actionable, but the intimacy in those words, the possessive tenderness, the romantic undertones directed at an 11-year-old child, made Diane physically ill. She'd taken the letter directly to Sister Margaret, expecting alarm, intervention, protection. What she got instead was something far worse. Sister Margaret read the letter slowly, her expression neutral, her fingers tracing the edges of the paper like she was examining evidence that might crumble under scrutiny. She was a woman in her late 50s who'd been principal at Catherine's for nearly 20 years, respected in the community, known for her firm but fair approach to education and discipline. When she finished reading, she placed the letter carefully on her desk and folded her hands over it, looking at Diane with eyes that showed something between pity and annoyance. She asked Diane what exactly she thought this letter proved. Diane, stunned by the question, said it proved Miss Corvus had inappropriate feelings for her 11-year-old daughter and needed to be removed from the classroom immediately, if not reported to the police. Sister Margaret's response would haunt Diane for the rest of her life. Sister Margaret explained, in the patient tone one uses with someone who's missing something obvious, that Mr. Corvus was a devoted teacher who'd shown nothing but care and dedication to his students for 6 years. She said that Becca was indeed a special child, gifted and mature beyond her years, and that it was natural for a teacher to recognize and nurture such exceptional qualities. She said the letter, while perhaps overly emotional in its language, was clearly the expression of a mentor who saw great potential in his student and wanted to encourage her intellectual and spiritual development. She said that in the modern age, people had become paranoid and suspicious of genuine, caring relationships between teachers and students, that everything had become sexualized when sometimes affection was simply affection. She said Diane needed to examine why she was so determined to see something sinister in what was clearly a beautiful mentorship, whether perhaps she was jealous of the connection Becca had found with someone who understood her better than her own mother did. Diane felt like she'd stepped into an alternate reality where words meant nothing and obvious danger was reframed as virtue. She tried to argue, tried to make Sister Margaret see how wrong this was, how the language in that letter was romantic, not mentorship, how a 34-year-old man should not be writing about our union to a 5th grader. Sister Margaret's expression hardened. She said that Diane was serious accusations against a respected educator based on her own misinterpretation of innocent words, that if Diane persisted in spreading these unfounded concerns, she could face legal consequences for defamation, that the school would not tolerate a parent attempting to destroy a teacher's reputation because of her own psychological issues. Then Sister Margaret did something that made Diane's blood run cold. She smiled, warm and reassuring, and said that she understood mothers sometimes struggled when their daughters began forming important relationships outside the family, that it was natural to feel threatened, but that Diane needed to trust the school's judgment and allow Becca to continue flourishing under Mr. Corvus's guidance. Diane left that office feeling like she'd been gaslit into questioning her own sanity. She sat in her car in the school parking lot for 20 minutes, shaking, the letter clutched in her hands because Sister Margaret had given it back to her, saying she should return it to Miss Corvus since Diane had taken it without permission. The world felt unreal, like she'd discovered that all the rules she thought existed to protect children had been suspended and nobody else noticed or cared. She drove home and told Robert everything that had happened. Robert, who'd been growing increasingly frustrated with what he saw as Diane's obsession, exploded. He said she'd embarrassed their family by making wild accusations to the principal, that she'd potentially damaged Becca's educational future, that she needed to stop this crusade before she did real harm. When Diane showed him the letter, Robert read it and said he saw nothing inappropriate, just a teacher encouraging a student, that Diane was reading sexual undertones into perfectly innocent mentorship language. He said if she continued down this path, he would seriously question her mental stability. That night was the first time Diane understood she was completely alone in seeing what was happening to her daughter. Her husband thought she was crazy. The school thought she was paranoid and vindictive. The other parents thought she was overprotective. And Becca herself had been so thoroughly groomed that she saw Mr. Corvus as her protector and her mother as the obstacle to something beautiful. Diane lay awake that entire night wondering if maybe she was crazy, if maybe everyone else was right and she was projecting her own fears onto innocent interactions. But then she'd remember how Mr. Corvus looked at Becca, how Becca had started talking like an adult reciting someone else's philosophy, how that letter talked about our union like it was destiny, and she knew with absolute certainty that her daughter was in danger even if nobody else could see it. The situation accelerated rapidly after that meeting. Within a week, Mr. Corvus had arranged another parent conference, this time requesting that Robert attend alone since Diane had been emotionally volatile during their last interaction. Robert went without telling Diane until afterward. When he came home that evening, he sat Diane down and explained that Mr. Corvus had expressed concerns about Diane's mental health and how it was affecting Becca. Mr. Corvus had documentation of Diane's increasingly paranoid behavior, including her accusatory meeting with Sister Margaret and her attempts to isolate Becca from positive influences. He'd suggested, with great reluctance and obvious concern, that perhaps Diane should speak with a professional about her anxiety and paranoia before it caused lasting damage to Becca's development. Robert, convinced by Mr. Corvus's carefully constructed narrative, agreed. He told Diane she needed to see a therapist, that she needed to work through whatever was causing her to sabotage their daughter's education, that until she got help, he thought it was best if she stepped back from involvement in Becca's school activities. Diane realized with horrifying clarity that she'd been outmaneuvered. Mr. Corvus had spent months building credibility, establishing himself as the concerned educator, dealing with a difficult parent, creating a paper trail that made Diane look unstable while he looked reasonable. He'd turned her husband against her, convinced the school she was the problem, and isolated her from her daughter. And he'd done it so skillfully that everyone involved thought they were protecting Becca from her paranoid mother, rather than protecting her from a predator. It was a masterclass in manipulation, and Diane was powerless to stop it because the more she fought, the more unstable she appeared. In June, as the school year wound down, Becca stopped talking to her mother almost entirely. She'd come home from school and go directly to her room, where she'd write in her diary or read the books Mr. Corvus gave her, or listen to the cassette tapes of classical music he'd recorded for her, with his own voice discussing the compositions between tracks. When Diane tried to initiate conversations, Becca would respond in monosyllables, or not at all. The few times Diane pushed harder, trying to reach her daughter through the wall Mr. Corvus had built between them, Becca would say things like, "You wouldn't understand," or "Mr. Corvus says people fear what they can't comprehend," or "Real love requires courage that most people don't have." It was like her 11-year-old daughter had been replaced by someone else, someone who spoke in quotes and looked at her mother with a mixture of pity and disdain. The last week of school, Mr. Corvus announced that he would be hosting a small end-of-year celebration for his advanced students and their families. 5 families were invited, including the Thorn. It would be held at his apartment on Saturday evening, just a casual gathering to celebrate the students' achievements and discuss summer enrichment opportunities. Robert accepted immediately, pleased that despite Diane's behavior, Miss Corvus was still willing to include their family in this special event. Diane didn't want to go, but Robert insisted, said she needed to make amends for her accusations, needed to show Mr. Corvus and the other families that she wasn't the unstable person she'd made herself appear to be. The party was surreal in its normalcy. Mr. Corvus's apartment was neat and tastefully decorated with bookshelves lining the walls and classical music playing softly in the background. The other families were pleasant, their children well-behaved, everyone drinking wine or soda and eating catered appetizers while discussing summer plans and fall enrollment. Mr. Corvus was the perfect host, attentive and charming, making sure everyone felt welcome and valued. He gave a short speech about the joy of teaching and how these 5 students represented the best of what education could achieve when students, teachers, and families worked together in trust and support. Everyone applauded. Diane felt like she was watching a stage play where she was the only person who could see the actor's true face behind the mask. What made it truly disturbing was how Miss Corvus had arranged the seating so that Becca was always near him, how he'd touch her shoulder when making points about her achievements, how he'd look at her with an intensity that nobody else seemed to notice or find concerning. At one point he gave each of the 5 students a small gift, books he'd selected specifically for them. For Becca, he'd chosen a leather-bound edition of Elizabeth Barrett Browning's Sonnets from the Portuguese, and when he presented it to her, he recited from memory, "How do I love thee? Let me count the ways," while maintaining eye contact with an 11-year-old child. The other parents thought it was beautiful, this teacher who cared enough to memorize poetry for his students. Diane wanted to scream. Near the end of the evening, Corvus asked to speak with Robert privately in his study. They were gone for nearly 20 minutes. When they returned, Robert had a strange expression on his face, something between confusion and wonder. He didn't say anything about the conversation until they were driving home, Becca asleep in the back seat. Then Robert, his voice quiet and uncertain, told Diane that Mr. Corvus had shared something remarkable and potentially controversial, something that would require an open mind and trust in unconventional wisdom. Diane's stomach dropped. She asked what he meant. Robert said Miss Corvus had explained that very rarely, perhaps once in a generation, a teacher encountered a student whose soul was so evolved, so mature beyond their physical years, that a connection formed that transcended traditional teacher-student relationships. He said Miss Corvus believed Becca was such a soul, and that he himself had experienced a spiritual awakening in knowing her. Diane asked what exactly that meant, her voice barely steady. Robert, still processing what he'd been told, explained that Miss Corvus had studied extensively about historical examples of age-transcendent connections, relationships that society initially condemned but later recognized as profound and legitimate. He mentioned examples from literature and history, from other cultures, where such unions were celebrated rather than forbidden, from philosophical and spiritual traditions that understood love as existing beyond physical or temporal limitations. He said Miss Corvus believed that he and Becca shared something rare and beautiful, something that would require patience and discretion, but was ultimately destined to be recognized as pure and good. Robert said all this like he was trying to convince himself it made sense, like he knew he should be horrified, but the way Mr. Corvus had presented it had made it sound almost reasonable, almost enlightened. Diane felt the world collapse around her. She understood suddenly and with absolute clarity what Mr. Corvus had been building toward all year, what he'd been grooming not just Becca for, but the entire family, the entire school community. He wasn't planning to hide his abuse. He was planning to normalize it, to present it as something beautiful and evolved that only special people could understand. He was planning to marry her 11-year-old daughter, and he'd spent months laying the groundwork to make it seem acceptable. She asked Robert if he understood what he was describing, if he realized that a 34-year-old man had just told
him he had romantic feelings for their 5th-grade daughter.
Robert, defensive and confused, said Diane was deliberately misunderstanding, that Mr. Corvus had been very clear this was about spiritual connection, not physical attraction, that it was about recognizing Becca's extraordinary maturity and ensuring she had the guidance she needed to flourish into the remarkable woman she was destined to become. Diane realized her husband had been successfully groomed alongside their daughter, that Mr. Corvus had masterfully reframed pedophilia as enlightenment and found a way to make it sound intellectual and spiritual rather than criminal. She told Robert they needed to go to the police immediately, that what Mr. Corvus had described was grooming and predation, regardless of how he dressed it up in philosophy and poetry. Robert refused. He said they had no evidence of any crime, that Mrs. was being careful to present everything as theoretical and spiritual, rather than physical or immediate, that going to the police with accusations based on Diane's interpretation of private conversations and heartfelt letters would only make them look foolish and potentially open them to legal action. He said he wasn't sure how he felt about what Miss Corvus had shared, that he needed time to process it, but that he knew with certainty that destroying a good man's reputation based on Diane's paranoid assumptions was wrong. They didn't speak for the rest of the drive home. Diane carried sleeping Becca up to her room, tucked her into bed, and sat watching her daughter's face in the dim light filtering through the window. Becca looked so young in sleep, her features soft and childlike, a stuffed rabbit tucked under one arm, and her thumb resting near her mouth, like she might unconsciously seek that infant comfort. Looking at her, Diane couldn't understand how any adult could look at this child and see a romantic partner, couldn't comprehend how an entire community could be convinced that there was anything acceptable about a grown man pursuing an 11-year-old. But she also understood that she was losing, that Mr. Corvus had built something so insidious and so carefully constructed that fighting it made her look insane while he looked noble. The next morning, Diane called her sister in Ohio and asked if she and Becca could come stay for the summer. She didn't explain why, just said she needed some distance and space to think. Her sister agreed immediately, no questions asked. Diane started packing that afternoon while Robert was at work, and Becca was at a friend's house. She was throwing clothes into suitcases when Robert came home early and found her. He asked what she was doing. She said she was taking Becca away from Millbrook Ridge, away from Mr. Corvus, somewhere safe, where she could deprogram her daughter from whatever had been done to her mind. Robert stood in the doorway of their bedroom and told Diane very calmly that if she tried to take Becca out of state without his permission, he would call the police and report a parental kidnapping. He said Diane was clearly having a mental breakdown and he couldn't allow her to traumatize their daughter by dragging her across the country based on delusional fears. Diane looked at her husband and understood that she'd lost him completely, that Miss Corvus had turned her own spouse into an obstacle between her and her daughter's safety. She asked Robert if he truly believed there was nothing wrong with a 34-year-old man talking about destiny and spiritual unions with their 11-year-old daughter. Robert said he didn't know what he believed, but he knew that Diane was acting irrationally and that the best thing for Becca was stability and consistency. Not being ripped away from her school and her teacher because her mother couldn't cope with her growing up. He said he'd scheduled an appointment for Diane with a psychiatrist for the following week, that he expected her to attend and to seriously engage with getting help, and that until she demonstrated improved mental health, he would be making all major decisions regarding Becca's welfare. Diane unpacked the suitcases. She had no legal standing to take Becca without Robert's consent, and if she tried, she'd lose all access to her daughter entirely. She was trapped in a nightmare where everyone around her had been convinced that the monster was a saint and she was the danger. She went to the appointment with the psychiatrist, a middle-aged man named Dr. Harrison, who'd been recommended by Sister Margaret. She tried to explain what was happening with Mr. Corvus and Becca, tried to make him understand the grooming and manipulation she was witnessing. Dr. Harrison listened patiently, took notes, and then gently suggested that Diane was experiencing a form of anxiety disorder, possibly rooted in her own childhood experiences with authority figures, that she was projecting her fears onto her daughter's teacher because she was struggling to accept Becca's growing independence. He prescribed medication for anxiety and recommended weekly therapy sessions to work through her trust issues. Summer began, and Becca spent 3 days a week with Mr. Corvus, officially for continued academic tutoring, but Diane knew it was something far worse. Becca would leave in the morning and return in the evening, quiet and distant, smelling like Mr. Corvus's apartment, which had a distinctive scent of old books and the specific brand of coffee he drank. When Diane tried to ask what they did during these sessions, Becca would say they read together, or discussed philosophy or listened to music. She never gave details, never shared specifics, and Diane suspected she'd been instructed not to, that Mr. Corvus was careful to keep the actual content of their time together vague and unverifiable. Robert saw nothing wrong with this arrangement, said it showed remarkable dedication from a teacher to continue working with a student over summer break, said Diane should be grateful rather than suspicious. In July, something shifted in Becca that Diane couldn't quite identify but felt in her bones was significant. Becca started talking about the future, about how things were going to change soon, about how people would have to accept what they didn't understand because truth was more important than convention. She said it with a certainty that was chilling in an 11-year-old, with the conviction of someone who'd been promised something and believed absolutely in that promise. When Diane asked what she meant, Becca smiled in a way that looked wrong on her young face, too knowing and too adult, and said, "Mr. Corvus says all great love stories face persecution before they're recognized as beautiful." Diane felt sick, but she had no moves left to make, no authority to appeal to, no one who would listen to her warnings. The announcement came on August 3, 1984, in the form of a letter delivered to every family in the St. Catherine's elementary community. It was printed on the school's official letterhead, signed by both Sister Margaret and Mr. Daniel Corvus, written in language that managed to sound both formal and warmly enthusiastic. The letter explained that the school community would soon witness something extraordinary and beautiful, a union that transcended conventional understanding and represented the highest ideals of spiritual connection and intellectual companionship. It explained that Mr. Corvus and his student Rebecca Ann Thorne had discovered through their educational relationship a profound soul-level bond that both families and the school administration had carefully observed and prayerfully considered. It explained that after extensive consultation with religious counselors, educational psychologists, and legal advisors, the decision had been made to formalize this connection through a ceremonial union that would take place on August 25th in the school gymnasium, and that the entire community was invited to celebrate this testament to love's ability to transcend artificial social boundaries. Diane read the letter 3 times, each reading making her feel more disconnected from reality, like she'd slipped into a parallel dimension where the laws of basic human decency no longer applied. The letter never used the word marriage, but that's clearly what it described. It never acknowledged that Rebecca was 11 years old, referring to her instead as a soul of extraordinary maturity and a consciousness that exceeds temporal limitations. It never addressed the obvious predation, instead framing everything as a beautiful meeting of minds that ignorant people might misunderstand, but enlightened individuals would recognize as pure. It provided a phone number for community members who had questions or concerns, encouraging open dialogue and understanding. At the bottom, in smaller print, it noted that the union had been reviewed by the school's legal counsel and found to be in compliance with relevant regulations given the ceremonial rather than legally binding nature of the event. Diane called the number immediately, her hands shaking so badly she could barely dial. A woman answered, identifying herself as Mrs. Patricia Hendricks, the school board president. Diane, her voice rising despite her attempts to stay calm, demanded to know how the school could possibly endorse a teacher marrying an 11-year-old student. Mrs. Hendricks responded in the patient, slightly condescending tone of someone who'd been prepared for this exact reaction. She explained that it wasn't legally a marriage, that no marriage license would be filed with the state, that it was a spiritual ceremony recognizing a profound connection between two souls. She said that Becca's parents had given their full consent after extensive counseling and education about the nature of transcendent relationships. She said the school had consulted with religious scholars who confirmed that age-based restrictions on spiritual unions were relatively modern inventions, and that historically many cultures recognized soul bonds, regardless of physical age. She said that anyone who attended the ceremony would understand its beauty and purity, but that those who couldn't open their minds to unconventional love were not required to participate. Diane asked how Robert could have consented to this without telling her. Mrs. Sins. Hendricks paused, then said carefully that Mr. Thorne had legal custody and decision-making authority regarding Becca's welfare, and that his consent was sufficient. Diane felt the ground drop out from under her. She asked what that meant. Miss Hendricks explained that Robert had filed paperwork with the court establishing that Diane was experiencing severe mental health issues that impaired her judgment regarding their daughter's welfare, that a family court judge had reviewed the evidence including statements from Sister Margaret, Dr. Ishan, and several other community members, and had granted Robert temporary sole custody pending Diane's completion of psychiatric treatment. The hearing had taken place 2 weeks ago. Diane hadn't known it was happening because Robert's attorney had argued that informing her would trigger an unstable episode that could endanger Becca. The judge had agreed. Diane hung up and immediately called Robert at his office. When he answered, she was screaming, demanding to know how he could have taken away her custody without telling her, how he could have consented to their 11-year-old daughter marrying her teacher. Robert, his voice maddeningly calm, said he'd done what was necessary to protect Becca from Diane's increasingly dangerous delusion. He said the custody hearing had been painful but necessary, that multiple professionals had testified about Diane's mental instability, that the judge had seen clearly that Diane's paranoid obsession with Mr. Corvus was harmful to Becca's well-being. He said he'd consented to the ceremony because after months of counseling with religious advisors and educational consultants, he'd come to understand that what Miss Corvus and Becca shared was genuine and pure, that it was his responsibility as a father to support his daughter's happiness even when it challenged conventional thinking. He said Diane could attend the ceremony if she promised to behave appropriately, or she could stay away, but either way it was happening and she had no legal standing to prevent it. Diane called the police. She was transferred 3 times before reaching Detective Frank Morrison, who listened to her explanation with what sounded like genuine concern. He asked her to come to the station and bring any evidence she had. Diane drove there immediately, carrying the letters from Miss Corvus, copies of the school announcement, documentation of the overnight trips, everything she'd been collecting for months. Detective Morrison reviewed it all carefully, his expression growing darker as he read. When he finished, he looked at Diane with something like pity and said he understood her concerns, but there was nothing the police could do. He explained that no crime had been committed because there was no evidence of sexual contact between Miss Corvus and Becca, that the ceremony wasn't a legal marriage and therefore didn't violate any statutes, that Becca's father had consented to her participation in what was essentially a school event, and that without evidence of actual abuse, the police had no grounds for intervention. He said his hands were tied by the law. Diane asked what kind of law allowed a grown man to hold a wedding ceremony with a child. Detective Morrison said quietly that he agreed it was wrong, that everything about the situation made his skin crawl, but that Miss Corvus had been very careful to stay within legal boundaries. He'd never teased Becca inappropriately where anyone could witness or prove it. He'd framed everything as spiritual and intellectual rather than physical or sexual. He'd obtained parental consent and school endorsement. He'd structured the ceremony to be symbolic rather than legally binding. He'd built the perfect trap where everyone knew what was really happening, but nobody could prove anything actionable in court. Detective Morrison said he'd keep the file open and would investigate if any evidence of actual abuse emerged, But as things stood, there was nothing he could charge Mr. Corvus with. He suggested Diane contact a family attorney about fighting the custody ruling, but warned her that given the documented support Mr. Corvus had from the school, medical professionals, and her own husband, it would be an uphill battle. Diane left the police station feeling completely defeated. She drove aimlessly for hours trying to figure out what to do, who else she could appeal to, how she could stop what was about to happen to her daughter. She called her sister in Ohio and explained everything. Her sister, horrified, offered to hire an attorney to help Diane fight for custody, to do whatever was needed. But they both knew that legal processes took time, and the ceremony was scheduled for 3 weeks away. Even if Diane filed an emergency custody motion, it wouldn't be heard before August 25th. Mr. Corvus had timed everything perfectly, had built his case so methodically, that by the time his true intentions became undeniable, all the pieces were in place to make stopping him legally impossible. Diane tried talking to other parents in the community, hoping to build opposition to the ceremony, hoping that enough voices raised in protest might force the school to cancel it. Most parents she contacted already knew about the announcement. Their reactions ranged from uncomfortable acceptance to genuine enthusiasm. One mother said she thought it was beautiful that the school was progressive enough to recognize that love existed beyond societal convention. Another said that while it seemed unusual, she trusted Sister Margaret's judgment and believed that if the school endorsed it, there must be something legitimate about the connection. The father said his son had been in Mr. Corvus's class 2 years ago, and the man was a saint who would never do anything inappropriate, that people needed to stop being so closed-minded about relationships that didn't fit traditional mold. A few parents expressed discomfort but said they didn't want to cause problems or judge something they didn't fully understand. Only 2 parents out of the dozens Diane contacted expressed outright horror, and both said they felt powerless to do anything because the school and Becca's own father supported it. One of those horrified parents was Margaret Chen, whose daughter Lisa was Becca's best friend. Margaret called Diane 3 days after the announcement and asked to meet in person. They sat in a coffee shop on the edge of town, both women looking exhausted and frightened. Margaret said Lisa had been increasingly uncomfortable about Becca's relationship with Mr. Corvus for months. That Becca had been telling Lisa things that sounded wrong but that Lisa hadn't understood how to articulate or who to tell. Margaret had only paid attention after the announcement, when Lisa came to her crying and saying she was scared for Becca. Margaret asked Lisa what Becca had told her. Lisa said Becca talked about how Mr. Corvus said they were soulmates from past lives, how he said their love was so pure that other people's rules didn't apply to them, how he said that when she was a little older they would be together openly and everyone would understand. Lisa said Becca seemed happy when she talked about it, but also strange, like she was repeating things she'd memorized rather than expressing her own feelings. Margaret and Diane discussed going to the media, making enough noise that outside attention would force intervention, but they both knew how it would play out. Mr. Corvus would present himself as a devoted teacher, being persecuted by closed-minded individuals who couldn't accept unconventional connections. Sister Margaret would testify to his character. Robert would appear as the reasonable father supporting his daughter against her unstable mother. Becca herself, thoroughly groomed, would probably defend Mr. Corvus and say she wanted the ceremony. The story would become about religious freedom and alternative relationships rather than about a predator who'd successfully normalized his abuse. They might get attention, but would it be the right kind, or would it just give Mr. Corvus a larger platform to spread his carefully crafted narrative about transcendent love? The 2 weeks before the ceremony were the worst of Diane's life. She was living in the house but essentially under Robert's supervision, her access to Becca limited and monitored. Robert had moved into the guest room and watched Diane constantly, clearly afraid she might try to flee with Becca or do something dramatic to stop the ceremony. Becca barely spoke to her mother, spending most of her time in her room reading or writing or listening to the tapes Corvus made for her. The few conversations they had were brief and painful, with Becca treating Diane like an ignorant obstacle to her happiness. Once Diane tried to sit Becca down and explain that what Miss Corvus was doing wasn't love, but manipulation, that 11-year-olds couldn't consent to romantic relationships with adults, that she was being hurt even if she didn't recognize it yet. Becca looked at her mother with something like contempt and said that Diane's inability to understand transcendent connection was exactly why Miss Corvus said most people would never accept them, that small minds feared what they couldn't comprehend, that Diane was proving herself to be exactly the kind of person who would have persecuted great love stories throughout history. Diane researched programming techniques, read about cult psychology and grooming tactics, desperately tried to find a way to reach her daughter through the layers of manipulation Mr. Corvus had constructed, but everything she read confirmed what she already knew, that programming took time and required removing the victim from the influence of their abuser, neither of which she had access to. She was trapped watching her daughter march towards something horrific while being powerless to prevent it. She called Child Protective Services and filed a report. A caseworker came to the house, interviewed Robert and Becca separately, reviewed the school's endorsement of the ceremony, and concluded that while the situation was unusual, there was no evidence of abuse or neglect that warranted state intervention. The caseworker noted that Becca appeared happy and well-adjusted, that she expressed enthusiasm about the ceremony, that her father was supportive and engaged, and that the mother's concerns seemed rooted in personal conflict with the teacher rather than legitimate child safety issues. 3 days before the ceremony, Diane received a call from a reporter at the Philadelphia Inquirer who'd somehow heard about the situation and wanted to do a story. Diane agreed immediately, hoping that media attention might still change something. She spent 2 hours on the phone with the reporter, explaining everything that had happened, providing documentation, expressing her horror at what the community was allowing. The reporter seemed genuinely disturbed and said the story would run the next day. Diane felt a flicker of hope, but when the article appeared, it wasn't what she'd expected. The headline read, "Controversial Ceremony Divides Small Town, School Plans Financial Union Between Teacher and Student." The article presented both sides as equally valid perspectives. Interviewed Sister Margaret, who eloquently defended the ceremony as a celebration of intellectual and spiritual connection, quoted Robert, saying his daughter was happy and he supported her choices, included a statement from Miss Corvus about how true understanding required open minds and brave hearts. Diane's concerns were mentioned but framed as one mother's controversial opposition, rather than the obvious truth that a child was being abused in plain sight. The article did generate attention, but not the kind that helped. Some readers were outraged and called the school, demanding the ceremony be cancelled. But others defended it, argued in letters to the editor that society was too rigid about age and relationships, that if everyone involved consented and the connection was genuine, who had the right to judge? The controversy became philosophical rather than protective, a debate about unconventional love rather than a clear case of predation. Mr. Corvus gave an interview to a local news station where he appeared thoughtful and sincere, explaining that he understood why some people were uncomfortable, but that throughout history the greatest love stories had faced persecution from those who couldn't see beyond conventional boundaries. He never said anything explicitly inappropriate, never admitted to anything sexual, but the implications were clear to anyone paying attention. The problem was that most people weren't paying attention to the implications, they were paying attention to his performance of respectability. The day before the ceremony, Diane made one final desperate attempt. She drove to the courthouse and filed an emergency motion for custody, alleging that Robert was allowing their daughter to be groomed and abused. The motion was assigned to Judge Patricia Thornwell, a stern woman in her 60s known for taking child welfare seriously. Diane felt another flicker of hope. The hearing was scheduled for that afternoon, expedited given the circumstance. Diane appeared with a court-appointed attorney since she couldn't afford to hire one on short notice. Robert appeared with a well-dressed lawyer who'd clearly been preparing for this possibility. Sister Margaret appeared as a character witness for Robert. Harrison appeared to testify about Diane's mental state. Mr. Corvus, did not appear, strategically avoiding any direct, legal scrutiny. The hearing lasted 3 hours. Diane's attorney argued that the planned ceremony was evidence of grooming and that Becca was in danger. Robert's attorney presented documentation of Diane's diagnosed anxiety disorder, her history of paranoid accusations, testimonies from multiple community members about her increasingly erratic behavior, and Sister Margaret's statement that the ceremony was a legitimate spiritual celebration that Diane was mischaracterizing due to her mental illness. Dr. Harrison testified that Diane suffered from delusional thinking patterns fixated on her daughter's teacher. Robert testified that he'd tried to support his wife through her mental health crisis, but that her obsession with destroying Mr. Corvus had become dangerous to Becca's well-being. Sister Margaret testified that the ceremony had been carefully reviewed by religious and educational authorities and represented a beautiful recognition of a profound spiritual connection. Nothing more. Judge Thornwell listened to everything with an inscrutable expression. When the testimonies concluded, she asked to speak with Becca privately in chambers. Becca was brought in wearing a dress Diane had never seen before, her hair styled in a way that made her look older. She was in chambers for 20 minutes. When she emerged, her expression was neutral. Judge Thornwell returned to the bench and delivered her ruling. She said that while the planned ceremony was highly unusual and personally troubling to her, she could not find sufficient evidence of abuse or imminent danger to warrant emergency custody changes. She noted that Becca appeared articulate, intelligent, and genuinely enthusiastic about the ceremony when questioned. She noted that the ceremony was not a legal marriage and therefore didn't violate any statute. She noted that Robert had acted within his parental rights in consenting to Becca's participation in a school-endorsed event. She said that Diane's concerns, while understandable from a mother's perspective, were not supported by concrete evidence of harm sufficient to override the existing custody arrangement. However, Judge Thornwell also said something that gave Diane the smallest measure of validation. She said that the court strongly encouraged the school to reconsider the appropriateness of the ceremony, that regardless of its legal permissibility, it sent concerning messages about teacher-student boundaries, and that she would be requesting a formal review of Southern's policies regarding educator conduct. She said that if any evidence emerged of inappropriate contact between Mr. Corvus and Becca, criminal charges would certainly follow and custody arrangements would be immediately revisited. But as things stood, her hands were tied by the lack of actionable evidence. The motion was denied. Diane's temporary loss of custody remained in effect. The ceremony would proceed as scheduled. Diane walked out of that courthouse broken in a way she'd never been before. She'd exhausted every option, appealed to every authority, done everything she could think of to protect her daughter, and she'd failed completely. Mr. Corvus had won. He'd successfully convinced an entire community that abusing an 11-year-old was actually a beautiful spiritual ceremony worthy of celebration. And tomorrow Diane would have to watch it happen, powerless to stop it, while everyone around her smiled and took photographs and called it a miracle of love. August 25, 1984 dawned bright and clear, the kind of perfect late summer day that seemed designed for celebration. Diane woke at dawn after barely sleeping, her body exhausted but her mind racing with desperate last-minute scenarios for stopping what was about to happen. She considered grabbing Becca and running, but Robert had anticipated this and had essentially locked Diane in the house the night before, taking Becca to stay with his parents to prepare for the ceremony. She considered calling in a bomb threat to the school, anything to stop the event, even temporarily, but she knew it would only delay the inevitable and probably get her arrested. She considered showing up and making a scene, screaming the truth until someone listened, but she knew how that would play out. She'd be removed as a hysterical woman having a breakdown while the ceremony continued without her, and she'd lose whatever tiny remaining access to Becca she still had. So instead, Diane got dressed in the clothes Robert had laid out for her the night before, a conservative blue dress appropriate for a formal school function, and she waited. Robert came to get her at 10 in the morning, his expression carefully neutral. He didn't speak to her during the drive to St. Catherine's, When they arrived, the parking lot was already nearly full. Diane recognized cars belonging to parents from school, community members, even the mayor's distinctive black sedan. Everyone was coming to witness what they'd been told was a beautiful spiritual ceremony, blissfully unaware or willfully ignorant of what they were actually celebrating. The school gymnasium had been transformed, white fabric draped from the ceiling, creating the illusion of an elegant hall rather than a space that normally smelled of sweat and rubber. Rows of white folding chairs faced a raised platform, decorated with flowers, candles and an archway covered in ivy and white roses. Classical music played from speakers, the same composers Mr. Corvus had been teaching Becca about all year. There was a guest book at the entrance where people were signing their names, and a table with a three-tiered cake decorated with white frosting and delicate sugar flowers. It looked exactly like a wedding, because that's exactly what it was, regardless of what legal semantics people used to pretend otherwise. Diane was directed to a seat in the third row, not the front where family would typically sit, another small reminder that she'd been demoted in her own daughter's life. Robert sat in the front row next to his parents, who'd traveled from Pittsburgh for the event. Around Diane, people chatted pleasantly, commenting on how lovely the decorations were, how thoughtful it was of the school to host such a special event, how wonderful that young Becca had found such a meaningful connection with her teacher. Diane felt like she was trapped in a nightmare where everyone else was sleepwalking, unable to see the horror unfolding right in front of them. Sister Margaret appeared from a side door and stepped up to a podium on the platform. She was wearing formal religious vestments, lending an air of sacred legitimacy to the proceedings. She welcomed everyone and explained that they were gathered to witness something rare and beautiful, a recognition of a spiritual bond that transcended conventional understanding. She spoke about how St. Catherine's prided itself on nurturing the whole child, not just academically but emotionally and spiritually, and how sometimes that meant supporting connections that challenged traditional boundaries. She said that after prayerful consideration and consultation with religious scholars, the school had determined that the bond between Mr. Corvus and Rebecca Thorne represented a legitimate spiritual union worthy of celebration and recognition. She invited everyone to open their hearts and minds to witness something extraordinary. The music changed to a processional piece, something baroque and solemn. The side door opened again and Mr. Corvus entered. He was wearing a dark suit, his hair neatly combed, his expression serene and slightly emotional, the perfect image of a man about to commit to something sacred. He walked to the platform and took his position under the flower arch, his hands clasped in front of him. The crowd turned to watch the main doors at the back of the gymnasium. Diane's heart was pounding so hard she thought she might vomit. She wanted to stand up and scream, wanted to run to those doors and block them, wanted to do anything except sit there helplessly watching this horror unfold. The main doors opened, Becca appeared, and the crowd gasped collectively at how beautiful she looked. Someone had put her in a white dress, something that looked eerily bridal despite its modest cut and knee-length hem. Her strawberry blonde hair had been curled and styled with small white flowers woven through it. She was wearing the necklace Mr. Corvus had given her months ago, and she carried a small bouquet of white roses. She looked like a child playing dress-up in adult clothes, except this wasn't play and this wasn't innocent. She was 11 years old, still losing baby teeth, still supposed to be reading age-appropriate books and playing with friends and worrying about homework. And instead she was walking down an aisle toward a 34-year-old man, while an entire community watched and smiled. Becca walked slowly, her steps measured like she'd been taught and rehearsed. She wasn't being escorted by her father, another departure from traditional ceremony that Diane suspected was deliberate. This wasn't about family giving away a daughter. This was about Becca choosing Miss Corvus of her own free will, cementing the narrative that she was an active, willing participant rather than a groomed victim. As Becca passed Diane's row, their eyes met briefly. Diane expected to see fear or uncertainty or some sign that underneath the grooming her daughter was still in there, still scared, still needing rescue. Instead, Becca's expression was serene, almost glowing, completely convinced of what she was doing. Mr. Corvus had done his work thoroughly. He'd made Becca believe this was beautiful. Becca reached the platform and stepped up to stand beside Mr. Corvus. He smiled down at her with an expression that made Diane's skin crawl, tender and possessive and triumphant all at once. Sister Margaret began speaking again, reading from prepared text about the nature of spiritual unions and how they were recognized across different faith traditions and historical periods. She talked about soulmates and destined connections and love that transcended physical or temporal limitations. She never once acknowledged that Becca was a child, instead referring to her as an old soul and a consciousness of remarkable maturity, and a spiritual being whose essence exceeds her years. It was linguistic gymnastics designed to obscure the obvious truth, and it was several days, describing every warning sign she'd noticed, every attempt she'd made to intervene, every authority that had dismissed her concern. Becca listened with an expression that cycled through disbelief, anger, grief, and something darker that Diane couldn't quite identify. When Diane finished, Becca was silent for a long time. Then she asked why Diane hadn't just grabbed her and run, taken her away illegally if necessary, protected her, by any means even if it meant breaking the law. Diane tried to explain about custody and legal consequences, and how she'd been afraid of losing Becca completely if she'd acted rashly. Becca looked at her mother and said quietly, "You should have taken that risk. Anything would have been better than what happened." That statement haunted Diane because Becca was probably right. In trying to work within the system, in trusting that authorities would eventually see what was happening and intervene, Diane had allowed the abuse to progress much further than it might have if she'd simply kidnapped her own daughter and disappeared. The legal consequences of that action would have been severe, but not as severe as what actually happened. It was a lesson in how systems designed to protect children can fail catastrophically when predators understand how to manipulate those systems, and how sometimes breaking rules is the moral choice even when it's the illegal choice. Diane would carry that guilt for the rest of her life, the knowledge that her daughter had been repeatedly raped because Diane had tried to do things the right way instead of the effective way. Robert, Becca's father, never recovered from what he'd enabled. After his release from psychiatric hospitalization following his suicide attempt, he'd tried to rebuild a relationship with Becca, but she wanted nothing to do with him. She told him through Veskers that she understood he'd been manipulated too, but that he was her father and his job had been to protect her, and he'd failed in the most fundamental way possible. She said she might forgive him someday, but she couldn't have him in her life while she was still trying to heal. Robert had spiraled after that rejection. He lost his job, lost their house, started drinking heavily. Diane heard through acquaintances that he'd moved to a different state and was living alone, unable to cope with what he'd done. She felt some sympathy for him because he'd been groomed alongside Becca, but she also felt rage because he was an adult who should have known better, who should have trusted his wife's instincts, who should have protected his daughter instead of handing her to a monster. The lawsuits came later, in 1987, 2 years after the conviction. Multiple victims, including Becca, filed civil suits against St. Catherine's Elementary, the Archdiocese, and several administrators for negligence and failure to protect students. The suits alleged that the school had received multiple complaints about Mr. Corvus over the years and had dismissed them all, that there had been a pattern of ignoring warning signs and prioritizing reputation over child safety. The discovery process revealed documents showing that at least 3 parents had complained about Mr. Corvus's behavior with their daughters before Becca, and that Sister Margaret had documented these complaints, but taken no action beyond speaking with Mr. Corvus privately, accepting his explanations and allowing him continued unsupervised access to students. The school's insurance company settled all the suits to avoid trial, paying out substantial sums, but admitting no wrongdoing. Catherine's Elementary closed permanently in 1988, unable to recover from the scandal and the financial impact of the settlements. The money from the settlement sat in a trust fund for Becca, untouched. She told Diane she didn't want it, that it felt like being paid for being raped, that no amount of money could compensate for what had been taken from her. Diane understood, but insisted the money stay available for Becca's future, for therapy or education or whatever she might need. Eventually Becca agreed to let it sit there, unused but available. The money couldn't heal the damage, but it could at least ensure that financial stress wouldn't compound the psychological trauma as Becca tried to build a life. In 1989, when Becca was 16, she started having panic attacks, triggered by seemingly random things. The smell of old books would send her into hyperventilation. Classical music would make her freeze and dissociate. The sight of men in suits made her nauseated. Vasquez explained that these were trauma responses, her nervous system reacting to sensory memories associated with the abuse. She taught Becca grounding techniques and coping commands, but the triggers remained. Becca's world became smaller as she tried to avoid situations that might provoke panic, which meant avoiding libraries and concerts and formal events and countless other normal activities. The abuse had ended 5 years earlier, but it was still controlling her life, still limiting her possibilities, still defining what she could and couldn't do. The worst trigger was seeing news coverage of similar cases. Unfortunately, the late 1980s and early 1990s saw increased awareness and reporting of educator sexual abuse, which meant stories similar to Becca's appeared in the news regularly. Each one would send Becca into days or weeks of regression, reliving her own trauma through the experiences of other victims. She'd become obsessed with following these cases, needing to know if the predators were caught and convicted, if the victims were believed, if justice was served. When predators walked free or received light sentences, Becca would spiral into dark depressions. When victims were blamed or disbelieved, Becca would rage and cry and sometimes hurt herself, scratching her arms until they bled, banging her head against walls, expressing through physical pain what she couldn't articulate verbally. Vasquez worked with her on managing these responses, but it was clear that Becca carried not just her own trauma, but a kind of collective trauma for all victims of educator abuse. In 1991, when Becca was 18 and legally an adult, she made a decision that terrified Diane. She said she wanted to visit Mr. Corvus in prison. Dr. Vasquez had mixed feelings about this, recognizing that it could be therapeutic if handled correctly, but also potentially re-traumatizing. After months of discussion and preparation, Vasquez agreed to support the visit with specific safety parameters. Becca would go accompanied by Dr. Vasquez. The visit would be limited to 30 minutes, and Becca would commit to intensive therapy sessions before and after. Diane was horrified but recognized she couldn't stop Becca, who was now an adult, making her own choices. All Diane could do was support her daughter and hope this wouldn't destroy the fragile stability Becca had built over 7 years of recovery. The visit happened in March 1991 at the State Correctional Facility, where Mr. Corvus was serving his sentence. Becca and Dr. Vasquez drove there together, while Diane waited at home, unable to eat or think about anything except what her daughter was walking into. Later, Becca described the visit in therapy sessions that Diane was allowed to attend. She said Mr. Corvus had aged poorly in prison, looking older than his 41 years, his hair thinning and grey, his face gaunt. He'd seemed genuinely surprised that Becca wanted to see him. They'd sat across from each other in a monitored visiting room, separated by a plexiglass barrier, speaking through phones. Becca had prepared what she wanted to say, rehearsing with Dr. Vasquez for weeks. She told Mr. Corvus that she understood now what he'd done to her, that what he'd called love had been abuse, that what he'd called spiritual connection had been manipulation, that he'd stolen her childhood and damaged her in ways she was still discovering. She told him that she'd believed him when he said she was special, when he said their connection transcended normal rules, when he said people who didn't understand were simply less evolved. She told him that she'd loved him the way a child loves a trusted adult, and he'd twisted that love into something sick and used it to rape her. She told him that she'd spent 7 years in therapy trying to rebuild herself from the ruins he'd made of her psyche. She told him that she was there to see him as he really was, not as the idealized figure she'd been groomed to perceive, but as the pathetic predator who'd destroyed multiple children's lives because he was too broken to form healthy adult relationships. Miss Corvus had listened to all of this with an expression Becca described as almost confused, like he genuinely couldn't understand why she was angry. When she finished, he'd said, and these words would be burned into Becca's memory forever, "I'm sorry you see it that way. I truly believed what we had was beautiful. I still believe that, Rebecca. Society's rules don't change what existed between us. You were special. You still are. What we shared was real, regardless of what they've convinced you to think." He'd said it with complete sincerity, apparently unable or unwilling to acknowledge that he'd committed any crime, that he'd harmed anyone, that his perception of beautiful spiritual connection had been predatory delusion from the start. Becca had stared at him through the plexiglass and realized something that was somehow worse than if he'd been consciously evil. He believed what he was saying. He'd convinced himself so thoroughly that his abuse was transcendent love that even prison and conviction couldn't penetrate that delusion. He wasn't a monster who knew he was doing wrong and did it anyway. He was a monster who'd constructed an entire philosophical framework to justify his predation, who genuinely saw himself as a misunderstood romantic rather than a serial child rapist. The scariest predators aren't the ones who know they're evil, they're the ones who believe they're enlightened. Becca had hung up the phone, stood up, and walked out without another word. In the car, driving away, she'd told Dr. Vasquez that she'd needed to see him to break the last remnants of his hold on her mind. That part of her had still wondered if maybe there had been something real in what they'd shared, if maybe the connection had been genuine even if the expression of it was inappropriate. Seeing him as a delusional middle-aged predator, rather than the powerful, charismatic figure her groomed mind remembered, had finally severed that last thread of doubt. She said it was like waking from a dream that had felt real while she was in it, but looked absurd once she was awake. She said she finally truly understood that everything he'd made her feel had been manufactured, that she'd been a victim, not a participant, that nothing about what happened had been her fault or her choice. The visit did trigger a difficult period of processing. Becca spiraled for several weeks afterward, but it was a different kind of spiral than before. This wasn't regression or doubt. This was rage. She was furious at Mr. Corvus, furious at the school that had enabled him, furious at her father for not protecting her, furious at a society that had let this happen in plain sight, furious at herself for having believed the lies even though she intellectually understood she'd been a child with no ability to resist manipulation. Vasquez said the anger was healthy, that it was a necessary stage of processing, that Becca needed to move through rage before she could reach acceptance. The anger lasted months, manifesting in destructive behavior like punching walls and screaming into pillows and writing letters to Miss Corvus that she never sent but that spelled out in graphic detail exactly what he'd done to her and what she hoped happened to him in prison. Eventually, the acute rage faded into something more manageable, a chronic low-level anger that Dr. Vasquez said would probably never fully disappear, but could be channeled productively. Becca decided to channel it into advocacy. In 1992, at age 19, she began speaking publicly about educator sexual abuse, telling her story at conferences and to legislative committees considering reforms to reporting requirements and background checks. She was compelling because she was articulate and educated, and undeniably damaged, living proof that this kind of abuse destroyed lives and that systems needed to do better at preventing and stopping it. She worked with other survivors to push for mandatory reporting laws, for stricter oversight of teacher-student interactions, for training programs to help educators and parents recognize grooming behaviors. It was painful work that required repeatedly reliving her trauma in public, but Becca said it gave her purpose, made her feel like the horror she'd survived might at least prevent similar horrors for other children. Diane watched her daughter transform from victim to advocate with mixed emotions. She was proud of Becca's strength and her determination to create meaning from suffering, but she also worried that Becca was defining herself too completely by her trauma, that she was building an identity around being a survivor, rather than allowing herself to be a full person with interests and relationships beyond advocacy work. Vasquez assured Diane that this was a normal phase of recovery, that many trauma survivors went through a period of intense activism before settling into a more balanced life. She said Becca needed to feel like she had power and agency, things that had been stolen from her during the abuse, and advocacy provided that in a concrete way. In 1994, when Becca was 21, she met someone. His name was Marcus. He was 23, and they'd met at a survivors conference where he'd been speaking about his own experience of childhood sexual abuse by a family member. They bonded over shared understanding of trauma, over the ways abuse shaped a life, over the difficulties of trusting and connecting after violation. They started dating cautiously, both of them navigating the complicated terrain of intimacy when sex had been weaponized against them in childhood. Becca told Diane it was different than anything she'd experienced before, because Marcus understood the triggers and the flashbacks and the moments where past trauma crashed into present intimacy. He was patient when she needed to stop, gentle when she needed reassurance, willing to move slowly through relearning that physical connection could be safe and consensual and good. Diane liked Marcus, though she was also wary of anyone who got close to her daughter. Probably would be for the rest of her life. But Marcus seemed genuinely kind, genuinely committed to his own healing and supportive of Becca's, and genuinely in love with Becca as a whole person rather than being attracted to her brokenness. They moved in together in 1995, both still in intensive therapy but building a life together. Two damaged people helping each other navigate a world that hadn't protected them as children, but that they were determined to make safer for future children. In 1996, Becca and Marcus got married in a small ceremony that was everything the ceremony in 1984 had pretended to be. This was real consent, real love, real partnership between two adults who chose each other freely. Diane cried through the entire wedding, both happy tears for the life Becca had managed to build and sad tears for everything that had been stolen, for the years of childhood that should have been innocent, for the trauma that Becca and Marcus both carried and always would carry. But there was also hope in that ceremony, proof that trauma didn't have to be destiny, that people who'd been broken could heal enough to love and trust and build meaningful lives. The nightmares never completely stopped. Becca still woke sometimes shaking and crying from dreams about the ceremony, about Mr. Corvus, about being 11 and powerless, and surrounded by adults who either couldn't or wouldn't protect her. But the nightmares became less frequent over the years, and when they happened, Marcus was there to hold her and remind her that she was safe, that Mr. Corvus was in prison, that she'd survived and built a life beyond what had been done to her. Recovery wasn't linear, wasn't complete, wasn't a destination she'd someday reach. It was an ongoing process, something she'd work at for the rest of her life. But that work was possible. That was the thing Diane tried to remember during the hard moments. Healing was possible, even if it was never complete. In 1998, Becca gave birth to a daughter. She and Marcus named her Elena, after Dr. Vasquez, who'd been instrumental in Becca's recovery. Holding her newborn daughter, Becca told Diane that she was terrified of failing Elena the way she'd been failed, terrified of not protecting her, terrified of missing warning signs or trusting the wrong people. Diane understood that fear intimately, having lived with it herself for 14 years. She told Becca that the fear was normal, that every parent who'd failed to protect their child carried that fear forward, that the key was using it productively, rather than letting it become paralyzing. She told Becca that Elena was lucky to have parents who understood predatory behavior, who would recognize grooming if they saw it, who would believe their daughter if she ever disclosed abuse. Becca and Marcus would make mistakes. All parents did, but they wouldn't make the mistake of dismissing their daughter's concerns or trusting authority figures who gave off warning signs. In 2000, Corvus came up for parole for the first time after serving 20 years of his 30-year sentence. Becca, now 31 and a mother, attended the parole hearing to deliver a victim impact statement. She brought Elena with her, a 6-year-old sitting in the gallery, visible proof of the life Becca had managed to build, despite what Mr. Corvus had done to her. Becca stood before the parole board and described in clinical detail how Mr. Corvus's abuse had affected her life. The years of therapy, the PTSD that would never fully resolve, the difficulties with trust and intimacy, the panic attacks and nightmares, the ways she was still discovering damage 2 decades later. She described how she'd had to fight for every piece of normalcy in her life, how nothing had come easily because everything was filtered through trauma, how even good things like her marriage and her daughter were shadowed by fear and hypervigilance, rooted in what Mr. Corvus had done. Then she told the parole board about visiting Mr. Corvus in prison 13 years earlier, about how he'd expressed no genuine remorse, no real understanding that he'd committed crimes rather than simply being persecuted for unconventional love. She said that based on that conversation and on letters Mr. Corvus had written from prison that had been entered into evidence, letters where he continued insisting that his relationships with students had been misunderstood rather than abusive, she believed he represented a continued danger to children. She said that parole required demonstrating rehabilitation and that rehabilitation required first acknowledging wrongdoing, something Mr. Corvus had never done and apparently never would do. She said if he was released, he would reoffend, that his delusions about transcendent love with children remained intact, that he'd simply learned to be more careful about not getting caught. The parole board denied his application. They would deny it again and each time Becca attended to ensure they heard a victim's voice, to make sure they understood the lasting damage Mr. Corvus had caused, to remind them that predators who don't acknowledge their crimes don't stop being predators. Mr. Corvus would remain in prison until 2015, when he died of a heart attack at age 65, having served 30 years of his sentence. Becca received notification of his death from the Department of Correction. She told Diane she felt nothing, not relief or satisfaction or even vindictive pleasure. He was simply irrelevant now, a problem that had been removed, a danger that no longer existed. His death didn't undo what he'd done, didn't heal the damage, didn't give back what had been stolen, but it did mean he'd never hurt another child, and that was something. In the years after Miss Corvus's death, Becca continued her advocacy work, but also expanded into other areas of her life. She got a degree in social work, specializing in trauma recovery. She worked with child victims of sexual abuse, using her own experience to connect with them in ways other therapists couldn't, helping them understand that what had been done to them wasn't their fault, that healing was possible even when it was hard, that their lives weren't defined by their worst moments. She said doing this work was painful because every client reminded her of her own trauma, but it was also meaningful because she could offer them something she desperately needed at their age, someone who truly understood. Her daughter Elena grew up knowing her mother was a survivor of childhood sexual abuse, though the specific details were age-appropriately filtered until Elena was old enough to understand more fully. Elena learned early about body autonomy and consent and warning signs of predatory behavior. She learned to trust her instincts about adults who made her uncomfortable and to tell her parents immediately if anyone crossed boundaries. She learned that secrets adults asked children to keep were never okay, that good adults didn't need children to keep secrets. She grew up safer than her mother had been, protected by awareness born from tragedy. Though Becca would have given anything to spare Elena the need for that awareness, Diane watched her daughter and granddaughter with complicated emotions. She was so proud of the life Becca had built, the healing she'd achieved, the advocacy work she'd done, the family she'd created. But she also carried permanent guilt for having failed to protect Becca when it mattered most, for having worked within systems that were designed to protect predators rather than children, for having trusted authorities who'd proven untrustworthy. Becca told her mother repeatedly that it wasn't Diane's fault, that Diane had tried everything possible within the legal and social constraints she'd faced, that blaming herself was both inaccurate and unhelpful. Diane understood that intellectually, but carried the guilt anyway, a permanent weight she'd never fully put down. In 2015, 31 years after the ceremony, Diane and Becca drove to Millbrook Ridge for the first time since they'd fled in 1986. The town had changed significantly. Catherine's Elementary was long gone, the building demolished and replaced with a small park. The church that had housed the gymnasium, where the ceremony took place, had been renovated and repurposed as a community center. Most of the people involved were dead or moved away. Sister Margaret had died in 1992. Robert had died in 2008 from liver failure related to alcoholism. Margaret Chen, the other mother, who'd seen the truth, had moved to California decades earlier. The town had moved on, though a small memorial in the park where Catherine's used to stand acknowledged the failures that occurred here and pledged never again. Vague enough to avoid legal liability, but specific enough that everyone knew what it referenced. They stood in that park, Diane now 63 and Becca 42, looking at the memorial and the playground where children played, unaware of the horror that had unfolded on this ground 3 decades earlier. Becca said quietly that she'd needed to see it, needed to confirm that the place that loomed so large in her nightmares was just a place, just a town, just buildings and streets with no inherent power except what she gave them. She said coming back helped her realize how much she'd healed, because standing here didn't destroy her the way she'd feared it might. It hurt, the memories were excruciating, but she could bear it. She survived, not just the abuse but the decades of recovery, and she was still here, still standing, still fighting. That mattered. As they drove away from Millbrook Ridge for what would be the last time, Becca said something that made Diane cry for hours afterward. She said, "Mum, I need you to know that I don't blame you. You tried everything. You saw the danger when everyone else was blind. You fought for me when everyone else thought you were crazy. You never gave up even when the systems failed. I know you carry guilt, but you should. The only person responsible for what happened to me was Daniel Corvus. Everyone else was either a victim of his manipulation or a bystander who didn't understand what they were seeing. But you understood, and you tried, and that matters. That has to matter." Diane wanted to believe her daughter. She tried to believe her. But late at night, when she couldn't sleep, she still thought about all the moments where different choices might have changed everything. If she'd grabbed Becca and run that day in May 1984 when she'd found the letter, if she'd been more forceful with Robert, more aggressive with Sister Margaret, more willing to make scenes and risk being labeled crazy, if she'd trusted her instincts over social pressure, if she'd prioritized being right over being liked, maybe Becca would have been spared the worst of the abuse. Or maybe it would have played out the same way regardless, because Mr. Corvus was skilled, and the systems were broken, and one mother's vigilance wasn't enough to overcome institutional failure. The truth was, probably, that both things were true simultaneously. Diane had done everything she realistically could within the constraints she'd faced, and Becca had still been brutalized. Systems had failed, but individuals within those systems had made choices that enabled that failure. Mr. Corvus bore ultimate responsibility, but he'd been helped by every person who'd dismissed concerns, explained away warning signs, prioritized reputation over child safety. Trauma wasn't simple. Responsibility wasn't singular. The world was full of people who'd done terrible things while convinced they were doing good, and full of people who'd failed to prevent terrible things while following rules that turned out to be inadequate. What happened in Millbrook Ridge in 1984 wasn't an anomaly. It was a pattern that repeated in schools and churches and youth organizations everywhere. Predators finding access to children while institutions protected reputations instead of victims. The only thing unusual about Becca's case was that the abuse had been so brazen, so public, that it had forced people to confront what they usually preferred to ignore. And even then, most people had chosen complicity over confrontation, celebration over protection. The ceremony where 73 people had watched an 11-year-old symbolically marry her 34-year-old teacher wasn't an aberration of human nature. It was a revelation of something dark in collective psychology, the willingness to normalize horror when presented with convincing narratives and social pressure. Becca lived with her trauma but wasn't defined by it. She was a mother, a social worker, an advocate, a survivor, a fighter, a person with joys and sorrows beyond the worst things that had happened to her. She had good days and hard days. She had nightmares and flashbacks and triggers that probably would never fully disappear. She had a marriage that worked because both partners understood trauma. She had a daughter she protected fiercely, maybe overprotected sometimes, but Elena was growing up safe and strong and aware. She had a mother who'd fought for her even when losing, who'd never stopped believing her, who'd never wavered in recognizing the abuse for what it was. That mattered. In a story full of failures, that vigilance mattered. The ending of this story wasn't neat or satisfying, because trauma stories don't have neat endings. Mr. Corvus died in prison, but the damage he'd caused lived on. Becca healed, but healing wasn't completion, wasn't erasure, wasn't restoration to what might have been. The people who'd enabled the abuse faced various consequences or none. Most of them convinced they'd been victims of manipulation rather than active participants in systemic failure. The town moved on, erected a memorial, told themselves they'd learned lessons. But similar abuse was probably happening there even now, because predators understand institutions, and institutions prioritize self-preservation over child safety. But here's what was also true. Becca survived. Against odds that had seemed insurmountable, against trauma that could have destroyed her, she'd built a life worth living. She'd found love and created family, and done meaningful work and experienced joy alongside the pain. She transformed her victimization into advocacy that had helped protect other children. She'd become someone her 11-year-old self could never have imagined being, someone strong enough to bear what had been unbearable. That wasn't redemption. Trauma wasn't redeemed by survival, but it was testament to human resilience, to the stubborn refusal to let predators win completely, to the possibility of healing even from wounds that never fully close. And somewhere in all of it, in the horror and the failure and the slow, painful recovery, there was a warning that everyone needed to hear. When someone tells you a child is in danger, believe them. When systems tell you to trust authority over instinct, question them. When community consensus says something wrong is actually beautiful, resist. When a predator is skilled enough to normalize abuse, be the voice that refuses to normalize it. Be the person who makes scenes, who gets labeled crazy, who prioritizes protecting children over maintaining social harmony. Because the cost of politeness is sometimes measured in destroyed lives, and being right but disregarded is better than being complicit in horror. You could have stopped. Diane had been that person, had fought when everyone told her she was wrong, and she'd still lost, but she'd been right, and she'd tried. And when Becca looked back on her childhood, searching for someone who'd seen the truth, she found her mother. In a story full of failures, that vigilance was the thread of light in the darkness. It wasn't enough, but it was something. It had to be something.